Hello and welcome to the 2019 Sizzling Summer Series, sponsored by the UNMC College of Public Health Office of Public Health Practice and our partners, the Midwestern Public Health Training Center and the Nebraska Association of Local Health Directors. My name is Katie Brandert. I am the Manager of Workforce Development and Leadership Programs in the Office of Public Health Practice, and I am your host for this series. This summer's series is focused on the strategic skill set of persuasive communication. Over the months of June, July, and August, we are hosting the three-part series, offering one part twice each month. Today's call is the psychology of persuasion. If you missed part one in June, do not worry, you will be able to pick up here today. The recording for part one will be made available very soon. Before I turn it over to our speaker, a few logistics. All participants are muted on today's call. The call will be interactive, however, so we're asking participants for their ideas along the way. So be prepared to use, and please do use, the chat function to respond to our speaker's questions for you. We will have a few minutes at the end of the call for questions and answers, and potentially in the middle as well. Please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions for the speaker. And when you submit them, I'll be keeping track of them and using them as we come to openings. If you experience technical difficulties throughout the call, please use the chat box feature for support. We are recording today's webinar, and the slides from today will be posted. If you're wanting to be able to follow along and take notes on today's call, you will find a link to a Google Drive document in the chat box that you can download. It is designed to help you follow along on the call today. Both the recordings and the slides will be made available after both webinars have occurred for the month. All registrants will receive an email from me when the recordings are available. A link to the evaluation will follow this call. Evaluation data will be used to inform the content for the next call in the series, for quality improvement on the series overall, and for reporting purposes to our funders. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. And we've been getting some fantastic feedback and have really appreciated it. So we hope that continues on today's call. Our speaker for this series is Kwame Christian. Kwame is an attorney, a mediator, a professor at The Ohio State University, an author, a podcast host, and a skilled chess player. Kwame also loves the field of public health, having spent time working on health equity and implicit bias research with the Kirwan Institute in Ohio before starting the American Negotiation Institute, where he conducts negotiation and conflict management workshops around the country. Kwame, I love thinking about psychology and human interactions, so I'm excited for today's topic. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to have you here today. There is a lot put into this psychology module here. So there's a lot to get to, but a few things before we start. I still want to have as much engagement as possible. That's what makes it really fun for me and for you too. So as I present, I'll ask questions. And of course, these are not rhetorical questions. I actually want some engagement here. And then also, when it comes to the Q&A section, I want to encourage you to ask specific questions about specific incidents you might have had in the past or hypothetical situations, because that's when it really gets real. So for example, in this situation, how would you have, what psychological principles would you have applied here? Those type of things. So we want to make it as real as possible. We've also included some case studies, again, to make it real. So be prepared to participate at that point. So without further ado, let's jump into it. All right, so this is a brief outline for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start off with the getting a better understanding of the psychology of persuasion. And then we are going to briefly touch on conflict management strategies because, of course, in the third series, in the third module, that's really what we're going to be focusing on intently, but I at least want to touch on it here. And then finish up with personality-based persuasion. Great. So question number one. So you can go ahead and type this into the chat. When it comes to persuasion, why is psychology so important?
All right, we've got to understand how people think. You use psychology to persuade people, to help understand how people may react. So you can read your audience. There is no persuasion without meeting people where they are.
Perfect. Yes, I love this. This is great. you all are spot on. It's about understanding where people are, what barriers they face psychologically and emotionally, and then predicting. So that is an important point. And so there's another point that we often miss when it comes to psychology, because we always focus on other people. Because most of the time when we say somebody's crazy in a conversation, it's not us, right? We always say it's the other person. So we need to figure them out. But really, before we even start analyzing other people, we need to get a better understanding of ourselves. What is happening inside of me? Emotionally, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? Why am I thinking and feeling these things? The better we understand ourselves, the better able we will be to work with other people. But it has to start with self-awareness. That's the first step of emotional intelligence, and an incredible part of this psychological persuasion here, the psychological equation here. We need to understand ourselves. And so the goal here is to be able to create personalized persuasive strategies when dealing with other people. We don't want to just have a blanket approach for persuasion. So think about the difference between the commercials we see on TV and the commercials we see on social media. The commercials we see on social media are a lot more targeted because they know a lot more about us in the creepiest way possible, right? They know us intently, they know what we're worried about. So the marketing is much more effective when it is social media because they know us better. So we want to bring in the same principles here. We want to get to know the other side as well as we possibly can, substantively based on what they need in the situation, but also emotionally and psychologically, so we can customize the persuasive strategy for the person who's in front of us. And the goal is to improve our success rate. The thing about persuasion that's really, really interesting is that we can do everything right in each of these conversations and still not get what we want. And that's frustrating. But if we understand psychology, we can improve our success rate. That's what we want to do. The better we are able to tailor these messages, the more successful we will be in these conversations. All right, emotions. What are emotions and where do they come from? Another discussion question for the class.
All right, so we've got automatic responses, the way people react. They come from our amygdala. Our lizard brain controls them. Reactions to situations based on past experience. Another comment about reactions to situations.
Great. Yes, this is fantastic, and I think this is one of the reasons I like presenting to public health folks, because you already know a good amount of this psychology stuff, so we can breeze through the base level stuff. But yeah, you're exactly right. These are automatic responses. They are rooted in the amygdala, which is the this. Let's get the image up here. This little part of the brain right here, part of the limbic system, which is, as you said, the lizard brain. And so it's where we find fight, flight, freeze. And then also there's another fear response that's very rare, and it's faint. And there is a certain, I think it's a breed of goat that this is their automatic response. Whenever they're scared, they don't run away, they don't fight, they faint. And that is, I'm going to show you a really quick picture of that right here. This is the goats falling over because they are afraid of this ominous umbrella. All right. And so the reason I show this is because when it comes to these automatic responses, I think this is a really great illustration of the fact that they're not always helpful. It's a lot of things, but this is not not helpful. And so for me, it begs the question, what are humans? Let's get a little bit of discussion here. What are humans? And this is, for me, the most important slide on this presentation. And I'm looking for a one-word answer. Let's see how long. Oh my gosh, Kelly, you're taking away all my fun. Emily, you too. You see that? Again, public health folks, you know the answer. We're animals. We are animals. And you know, when it came to my ability to level up in difficult conversations, because I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a mediator. So I'm in the middle of really heated conversations all the time. When I stopped thinking about people on a high level, and I started saying, what are we? We're humans. It made everything, we're animals. It made everything a lot easier for me, because whenever we're confronted with these difficult conversations, there are going to be automatic responses that we simply can't help. And a lot of times the people who we are talking to and negotiating with, these automatic responses will come up, and they will be significant barriers to us in these conversations. So we need to acknowledge them, and then we need to figure out ways to navigate around them in these difficult conversations. So, when it comes to your work in public health, what are some common emotional barriers that you face in your role? And why do you think you face them?
I think my passion gets in the way sometimes.
Yep. Yep. That's a good one. That is a very good one.
I've also got compassion fatigue, too much empathy, fear.
Good. And now, when it comes to compassion fatigue and empathy, let's lump those two together. What particularly is so difficult about that? What are you facing there?
In the meantime, somebody else says impatience,
Mm-hmm.
and
Absolutely.
being overwhelmed by other people's feelings. Stress.
Perfect. This is good. And I really want to focus in on that impatience part of it, because once we get a better understanding of the emotional barriers on the other side, and down the road, we're going to talk about personality, the personality barriers that we face, it really helps us to allocate the appropriate amount of energy to the conversations. Because sometimes we think that the points that we make are so brilliant that we should just take it to the conversation, and then that should be it. I presented you with this fact. I presented you with this data, this research, and that should be the end of the conversation. And so we think that we need this much energy, and then we're met with resistance, and it will take this much energy. And because we weren't expecting to bring that much to the table, it's really difficult for us to allocate the right amount of energy. So again, getting a better understanding of psychology helps us to have the necessary stamina in these difficult conversations. And so going back to it, I see when you realize that there's too much to do and only so much impact you can make, it creates a feeling of apathy, which is real, which is real. And I know for some, as somebody who worked in public health for a few years, that was something that I struggled with, because I said to myself, it hit me one day. I said, I'm not going to cure racism. I'm working on this health equity stuff, and these issues are not going to go away. What am I doing here? And I think what's important to do here, recognizing that this is a barrier that we can face. One of the keys to that, a solution that we have to that situation, is to have bite-sized chunks. We have to figure out, what is it that I can do? What's within my control? And I guess the psychological term that we're using, that we would use here, is the locus of control. Because the bigger the issue becomes, the more of it we try to tackle ineffectively, the lower our locus of control is. We say, I can't do anything about it. It creates learned helplessness, which leads to stress and apathy. So making our goals a little bit smaller and more manageable, not in the sense that we want to be less ambitious, but we also need to be realistic about what we can do in these situations. And so that's going to be one of the ways that you can manage your emotions when it comes to compassion and fatigue in these difficult conversations. Really, really great points. Thank you for that. All right. When you look at the implicit bias research, and I'm going to cite the book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, we realize that people often make decisions with their emotions and then subsequently justify it with logic. And so even though we understand that when it comes to implicit bias research, a lot of times when it comes to these difficult conversations, we latch on to people's initial responses as their final response, like what we should really, really focus on. When in reality, oftentimes what we are first confronted with in these difficult conversations is a logical articulation of their emotional selves. Even though it might sound like it's making sense, it might sound like a well-reasoned thought, what often happens is it is an automatic emotional response that has been articulated very well. And so one of the things that I like to think about it is I think about it as a politician who has a spokesperson. So you have a sloppy politician who just says whatever they want, and that's your amygdala, and then a spokesperson. So what often happens is the emotion comes up with the final decision, and then we justify our decision with logic. So it can sound professional, but it comes from the emotional part of our brain. And if we don't have an understanding of that, we're going to try to wrestle with the wrong part of the brain. We're going to try to make logical counter arguments in these interpersonal conversations, when what really needs to be addressed is the underlying emotion that led to the decision in the first place. And so what's important is that we need to recognize the limited value of reason. So facts, logic, rules, those are incredibly important things. But at the point when somebody's very emotional, these things are not going to be your tools of choice. You have to recognize when in a conversation to use this. And when the amygdala is firing, that's not the right time. And we're going to go deeper into this in the third presentation. But for right now, just realize that timing is important. And so this is the frontal lobe. This is where we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the highest level of thinking, very logical thinking. We have emotional regulation here, logical thinking, the ability to withstand temptation, those type of things. The best version of ourselves is right here in the frontal lobe, predominantly in the prefrontal cortex. Also executive function, that's where we're going to find this. And so during these difficult conversations, we want to try and bring the other person to a place of stability where they're using the best parts of their brain. And the same with us too. So if we are highly emotional and highly triggered, we need to recognize, listen, this is not the time for me to have this conversation or try to advocate passionately at this time, because I'm not thinking clearly. And so that helps us to create strategies, not only around the other person, but also for ourselves. And so going back to the timing issue, again, we said when the amygdala is firing, we're not supposed to make logical arguments because they won't work. We also need to recognize that during the conversation, when the amygdala is firing, we don't use the logical arguments, but maybe we might realize that the person is so emotionally triggered that today is not the right day to have the conversation. Maybe tomorrow, next week, we need to give them time to cool down. And one of the things that happens during sleep that's often overlooked is the fact that there's a lot of emotional regulation that happens during those sleep cycles. So that's why a lot of times you can go to sleep really, really frustrated, but typically you don't wake up with that same level of negativity. There's a little bit of alleviation. And so today might not be the best day for it. But bringing it back to the conversation, when we recognize the amygdala is firing, we know now is not the time to make productive, logical, rational arguments because they're not ready to handle it. All right, so I'm going to give a quick breakdown of the compassionate curiosity framework that I came up with for my book, Nobody Will Play With Me. And it's very simple. Number one, we're going to acknowledge and validate emotions. Number two, we're going to get curious with compassion. And number three, we're going to engage in joint problem solving. And again, we're going to get deeper next time, but I at least want to present the framework and recognize that acknowledging and validating emotions is number one before we get to reason because of the amygdala. So let's do an example. This will be a case study. So imagine you are working in a community and you are putting together an infant mortality program, but you're running into stakeholder resistance. So before we were focusing on our emotions, what emotions we're facing, but on their end, you're coming with a program that is meant to help the community, right? What emotional barriers could there be on their end when it comes to the institution of this new program?
Sadness that their community needs the program.
Yep, that's a great point.
Feeling that you're judging them for the result. Sad or retreating. Expense may go against religious beliefs or traditions. There may be distrust.
Right.
Complacency, not thinking the problem has anything to do with them, or denial of the need, or maybe they don't see it as a problem.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yes, exactly. These are the precise things that you're going to be confronted with. And here's the thing. Let's go back to our training. When we are trained, we are given a lot of data, a lot of research. We do this research, we create these studies, and then we come out with the right answer. And so when we have these conversations, if somebody says, okay, well, I don't think that this problem has anything to do with me, then we might present data. We might come with the right answer, right? But again, it might be an emotional issue. It might be an underlying emotional issue that's rooted maybe in distrust or fear, those type of things. We need to address those, and we need to acknowledge the emotion. So it's two parts, not just acknowledging the emotion through labeling the emotion, but also validating the emotion, because we want to let them know that, number one, I understand you, and number two, it's okay that you feel this way. In fact, it makes sense that you do, given your experience. And so a lot of times there's resistance because people feel as though we are judging them. And so when we are able to be humble enough to say, the way that you feel makes sense, and I understand because X, Y, Z, you have every right to feel this way, then that helps to alleviate the emotional barrier. So those are some things that we need to pay attention to whenever it is that we're trying to institute new programs or persuade people. We need to recognize their emotional barriers, label it, acknowledge it, and validate it. Let them know that it's okay. Perfect. All right, so questions here before we move on. What questions do you have? If you go ahead and put it in the Q&A spot, Katie will read them off.
And Kwame, there was a question of clarity. What were the 3 concepts on the last slide, meaning the slide before the community example?
Yeah, so the compassionate curiosity framework?
Yes.
Yes, so number 1, acknowledge and validate emotions. Number 2, get curious with compassion. And number 3, joint problem solving. And so it's a simple 3-part framework that you can use in any difficult conversation, because I recognize that when our systems are flooded with cortisol and our amygdala is firing, we probably won't remember more than 3 steps. So I made it intentionally simple so you can fall back on it in any conversation you have.
Perfect. And
Great.
I think we keep moving, and folks will add to the Q&A box as they have a question.
Great. All right. So let's move on to personality-based persuasion. Before we get into this, I want to introduce this idea of assumptions versus hypotheses. So I want you to think like a scientist, which probably shouldn't be too difficult for you. When it comes to assumptions, these are beliefs that we assume are true. We think that this is the way that it is, and we do not engage in further investigation to check our understanding. Versus a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable belief, right? So I think this is the case, and now I'm going to investigate it through this conversation. And I'm also willing to adjust my hypothesis because I might receive new information that changes my perspective. And so we always want to approach these personalities when we're trying to figure out where somebody lies on the spectrum of personalities. We want to think of these as testable hypotheses, not assumptions, because we're constantly going to be getting more and more data from every single interaction we have with people. So we need to be willing to adjust. All right, some major things to keep in mind. Number 1, as we go through this and we go through the different personality types, I want you to think about your strengths and your weaknesses when it comes to your personality, because you will definitely see you somewhere in this presentation. So pay close attention to what is good about the personality type you have and what might potentially be a challenge when it comes to these difficult conversations. And the next thing is, when you are faced with somebody with these various personality types, ask yourself, how would I persuade this person? What would my approach be? And then so what would my approach be? And then also number 3, what would the challenges be? All right, if I see this type of person in front of me, what are some common challenges to persuasion? And so again, we are finding ways to customize our persuasive strategies based on the person who's in front of us. Okay, so the 5 personality types that we're going to focus on today are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the acronym is OCEAN. So again, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay, so before we get into this, again, this is very, very important. So what color do you see here? If you had to pick one color from this image, what would it be?
Orange. Orange all around, it looks like.
Oh, wow. There
Cream.
we go.
Somebody said cream.
I like that Christina pointed out the minority in the group. That's good. Pink.
Pink. Peach. Red.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, so what we're seeing here, we're seeing multiple colors, right? But if you are presented, if you're asked the question, what color is this? It's going to be difficult because in order to pick one color, we need to completely ignore the other ones here, right? Because there are multiple colors here. And so that's the difference between a trait and a type. A lot of times people think about personality in terms of types. You are an extrovert, period. That's it. That might be a part of who you are, but it's not all of who you are. And so a trait is just one ingredient. Let's think of it like an ingredient. So yeah, there's a lot of extroversion in there, but what else is there? And it's important because we want to realize that when it comes to measuring personality types, typically we measure it on a scale of low to high, with 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And so when you think about the 5 different personality types with 5 different options between the strength of the personality type, you have 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5, which equals 3,125 potential personality variations. And so the reason I'm saying this is not to overwhelm you. I am not going to go through 3,000 plus personality variations. I don't want to do that myself. But the point is, I want you to recognize that people are complex. And we need to recognize that we need to realize that there are different elements that are going to make up the personality type. And those interactions between the personality types, they're going to matter. If you have somebody who is highly agreeable, but low on neuroticism, that's going to be very different from somebody who is high in neuroticism and low in agreeableness, right? The way that these things interact is going to have a significant impact on the personality we see in front of us. But let's start off with extraversion. All right, so with extraversion, we are thinking about it in terms, again, high and low. Extrovert on the high end and what we typically call introverts on the low end. And so when we're talking about extroverts, what are some characteristics that typically come to mind for you? Let's get some ideas here.
Outgoing, social, talkative, outspoken, loud, ha ha ha. Feed off interaction with other people, center of attention, get energy from being around others.
Yeah, you hit a lot of the main things. So one thing is the sociability. So how sociable are you? How much do you want to interact with people? And how much can you handle interacting with the people? The other thing is energy. Where does the person get their energy? They get their energy from interacting with people. Introverts, on the other hand, it's not that they don't want to interact with people, it's that they need less interaction to be satisfied. And then also when it comes to energy, introverts prefer to gain their energy by being more alone, time in solitude, time apart. That's how they recharge. They can be social, but the thing is, it drains them. And so that's why for me, I'm like right in the middle. So oftentimes when I do a presentation, I just need to go and be by myself for a few hours, take a nap and recharge because it's draining. And so a lot of times you'd be surprised that people who identify as introverts because they seem to be social, but then they disappear after some time. So again, recognize that introvert doesn't mean that you're antisocial. It just means it's more focused on the level of sociability you need and your energy. There is one really, really, really important thing about extroverts that is often overlooked, and this is assertiveness. Assertiveness. Extroverts are very, very assertive. And so, again, this is really important to recognize, because when it comes to assertiveness, a lot of times if somebody's very assertive, it can rub us the wrong way if it's not tempered with high in agreeableness, right? It could rub us the wrong way if somebody seems to be domineering. But when you recognize that extroverts, based on their personality type, tend to be more assertive, when you feel that pressure, it helps you to recognize that I don't need to take this personally. This isn't about me. They're not trying to just dominate me. This is who they are. This is part of their personality profile. And so keep that in mind for the rest of this presentation. When you realize the negative sides of these different personality types, it's not personal. And so if you realize that somebody has a personality type that might rub you the wrong way, it's not about you. It's about them. And again, that gives you more endurance in these difficult conversations, because you're not wasting emotional energy on feeling offended. Now you can brush it off and move on. Say, okay, I'll log that. That's a data point. I realize that might be part of their personality style. It's not about me. All right, let's move on. Neuroticism. And quick note, the order of this is based on the level of importance with regard to persuasion. Extraversion, identifying extraversion is very important when it comes to how you're going to persuade this person. One other thing that's very important when it comes to the conversations with extroverts versus introverts, the way that people process is an important part of the equation. So if I'm talking to an extrovert and I ask them a question, they're going to talk, and they're going to talk for a long time. And a lot of times the mistake that we make when we're dealing with extroverts is we take everything that they say as something that's concrete, when in reality, talking is part of their cognitive process. And in a lot of cases, your presence is almost incidental to the thought process that is occurring. When on the other hand, if you're dealing with an introvert and you ask an introvert a question, there will be a pause, because they process on a deeper but slower level. And so when I'm talking to an introvert, sometimes I would ask a question and then there would be a silence. And I start to wonder, what does this mean? Did I offend you? Are you upset? And so a lot of times if you have somebody who's high on the extrovert scale talking to somebody who's low on the introvert scale, they might ask a question, get 1 to 2 seconds of silence, and then just jump in and keep going because they think the other person doesn't want to talk. And that tension, that creates a feeling of tension in the extrovert. But the introvert is just thinking. They just want to think through their answer before giving it out publicly. And so when I'm dealing with an introvert, what I realize is that I need to slow down. And sometimes I even count to 3. Like, let me count to 3 or 4 before I try to jump in. And that helps me to calm down and focus on the person and not let my mind wander about all of the terrible things that could possibly be going on in their mind, because they're just thinking. It takes a little bit longer. So keep that in mind when you're having conversations with extroverts versus introverts. Now, neuroticism. This is the propensity to experience negative emotions. And that's it. So how likely are you to experience negative emotions? If you're very likely, then that makes you high in neuroticism. If you are not as likely, then you are low in neuroticism. And so when it comes to neuroticism in difficult conversations, what impact do you think that has when you're having a negotiation with somebody who is higher in neuroticism?
They're going to focus on the negative, big impact. They'll see negative impacts first. They'll make it an emotional situation. Take things personally.
Very good. Yeah, y'all are spot on, spot on. And so if you have a propensity to experience negative emotions, that means you're going to be more sensitive to the negative things. They're going to see risk first, not opportunity. And so when you realize that, okay, I'm dealing with somebody who is higher in neuroticism, that means that I need to take care to make sure that they feel safe. Safety is going to be their main concern. They don't care about how amazing this thing is going to be. They want to know about their safety. Am I going to be okay? Is my community going to be okay? Is my family going to be okay? That needs to be the first thing, because whenever it comes to persuasion, we are talking about changing the way that people think and the way that what they believe, and then the way that they act. Ultimately, it is about behavior change. And so the status quo is often seen, or at least felt, as safer by people who are highly neurotic, because they say, I don't know what the future holds. And that uncertainty is very scary. So you need to take care to make sure that they feel safe in these conversations. And so one is neuroticism, prevention focus. So if you are focused on prevention, let's look at this mousetrap as an example. You're going to see the cheese and you're going to try to get the cheese. I want that. That is my goal. I am going for the cheese. Somebody who is prevention focused, I see the mousetrap. I'm not going for the cheese because I see a mousetrap right there. And so promotion focused, these are people who are very goal oriented. Usually people who are extroverts are more likely to be promotion focused. And so understanding that difference between people will help you to craft your persuasive message. So if you're dealing with somebody who's high in promotion focus, you talk about how awesome this thing is, how great it will make the community, how much it would improve health outcomes. And then if it's prevention focused, you want to talk about the risk associated with staying here right now. Well, right now, the data says this: you are actually safer through behavior change. So that's the little tweak you'll make when it comes to promotion versus prevention focused when crafting your message. Agreeableness. And so when it comes to agreeableness, it's pretty straightforward. These are friendly people, but there are two levels to it. They like other people a lot. So, hey, I like you. I'm agreeable. I like you. But also, there's the flip side. They also like to be liked. So not only do I like you, I really, really want you to like me. So what impact do you think that has on difficult conversations if you're negotiating with somebody who is high in agreeableness?
They might say something but not follow through or not mean it. Real issues may never come out. Will avoid confrontation. They'll agree with you no matter what you think or they actually think or feel. They don't want to incur others' disapproval, so they won't say anything.
Yep, exactly. This is brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And so they want to please you. So these are people who tend to be people pleasers, and I'm one of them. This is one of my personal struggles. So this is one of the things that I shared in the book. This is something I struggled with. And so one of the things we need to recognize, if you're negotiating with somebody who is highly agreeable, you might get a deal pretty quickly. Hey, do you want to do this? Sure, I'll do it. Well, that was easy. We think that's great. But a lot of times there might be some hidden resentment by the agreeable person because they think you might have taken advantage of them, but they're not going to say anything because they don't want to risk the relationship. So a lot of times what you need to do is you need to bring up potential objections that you feel they might not have shared, because you want this to be a real deal, because they might not want to share those objections. Even if down the road it leads to the breakdown of the agreement that we've come to, they will not share that objection. So if a deal is going to break down, or if a relationship is going to be in jeopardy, you want that to happen during this conversation, right in front of you. Because if you just take that agreement, and then move forward without testing that agreement, then you're going to be in trouble, because it could break down in the future. So if you recognize you're dealing with somebody who's agreeable, you almost want to invite them to counter you, to say, listen, I want you to know it's okay if you don't agree with this. And if you don't, let me know and we can have a conversation with it. It's not a problem for me. And so saying that, inviting them to resist in that way, almost advocating on their behalf, actually lets them feel safer to state those issues that they have. And so if you are an agreeable person, one thing that I've done is engaged in rejection therapy. And so it's essentially my version of cognitive behavioral therapy, where I say, all right, the fear of rejection is terrifying to me. So what I'm going to do is every day I'm going to find little ways to be rejected by asking for something. So going to a donut shop and asking for a free pastry along with my coffee, something like that. That's something that I've done. And surprisingly, I got it. But a lot of times when I do it, I'm rejected. And it serves two purposes. So either one, I get what I ask for, which is great. Or number two, I'm rejected and I start to develop that realization that there's life after rejection. You need to become okay with risking failure in these difficult conversations. The next thing is shifting from the fear of failure to the fear of regret. So I ask myself, right now I'm afraid. I understand that I'm afraid of having this conversation or advocating for myself or my organization in this situation. But if I don't do this, will I later regret this? To me, the fear of regret powers me more than the fear of failure. And so you need to recognize whether or not this will have a long-term impact on you if you don't stand up for yourself in this moment. And so that fear motivates me. If I'm going to be motivated by fear, I want it to be the fear of regret, and that moves me forward. All right. Oh, also, there are going to be some people who are low in agreeableness. And I'm sure you can think of people who are low in agreeableness. They're just not friendly people. And it's not anything personal about you. This is just who they are. They're not that warm, fuzzy person. And so if you're having a difficult conversation with this person and you're getting a frosty response from them, it's easy to take that personally. And then it triggers our amygdala to respond with fight, flight, freeze, and hopefully not ever faint. Please don't faint in these conversations. But really, it can trigger us. But if we go in with that expectation saying, listen, I know Steve is a little bit frosty. And so if I get that cold response, it's not about me. That's just who Steve is. And so it helps me to maintain a high level of cognitive processes during this conversation, because I know that it's going to be a tough conversation and it might be a long conversation because they're going to be skeptical. All right, last one, conscientiousness. And just for the sake of time, these are the people who they're very reliable. They do what they say they are going to do. That's it. People who are not conscientious, they're not very reliable. And we can think about, it's very clear, people who are our friends who fall on this spectrum. So when you're persuading somebody who is conscientious, you need to make sure that your information, your evidence is lined up perfectly. They want well-reasoned arguments. So think about an engineer, an accountant, a lawyer. They're usually going to be higher in conscientiousness. So if you're going to persuade them, you need to come with the facts and the logic and the data and everything. Also, if you want to change their behavior, you want to make sure that the way that you provide the information and the way that you propose the program is put in a way that doesn't have a negative impact on their ability to deliver consistently. That's what they pride themselves in. If they say, okay, this is a new program, it's untested, I'm not sure whether or not we can get this done, whether or not I'll be able to perform at a high level, that concerns me. You want to be able to think about that in the beginning to persuade somebody who is very conscientious. If you're conscientious and you're dealing with somebody who is not conscientious, you need to realize that you're going to be annoyed during the conversation, because most likely the majority of humans are not as organized as you. And so that is going to be a level of frustration that you personally need to work through in these difficult conversations. Recognize that it's going to happen that people aren't as prepared for you as you. And so don't let that offend you, and don't take it as disrespect. People are just different. And then openness to experience. When it comes to openness to experience, if you're high in this, you're open to new things. So if I propose something to you, you might say, yes, absolutely, let's try that out. That sounds cool. And again, you might take it and say, this is great. I won. I got exactly what I wanted. But here's the problem. If somebody is very open to experience, it's easy to change their behavior, but follow through is difficult because they're so open that they come off as flaky sometimes. Hey, didn't you agree to implement this program in this way? Yeah, but then I got another idea, so I decided to do that. So you need to focus on follow through. The beginning of the conversation, getting them to commit won't be the problem, but getting them to actually follow through on their commitment will be. So the conversation, the negotiation, the persuasive process will be prolonged into the future, because you want to make sure that the commitment is real and they're actually following through with what they said they were going to do. If you're low in openness to experience, you don't want to try new things. That's it. You don't want to try new things. So if you're persuading this person, you want to let them know, you want to frame it in a way that allows them to think this isn't something brand new and untested. You're saying to yourself, oh, okay, this is a slight deviation from what we already have going on. Minor change. So that's how you want to market it to these people. So quick thing on the different ways that people are motivated. Example for my son. So Kai is my baby. You'll see him more in the next session, but he's 3 years old and he is just pathologically competitive, just like me. So when it comes to motivating him to get ready in the morning now, when he doesn't want to put on his clothes and get out of the house, sometimes I say, hey, mommy said she's going to get ready before you and she's going to beat you. And then he just jumps out of bed and he sprints, puts on his clothes and everything because he doesn't want to lose. He does not want to lose in anything. And so achievement motivation, these are people who want to win, very driven. So when you realize that somebody is very achievement oriented, then you want to make sure you frame it in a way that they can take it as a win. This is a win. So you want to get them to, you want to phrase your argument in a way that passes the acceptance speech test. If they were going to take this agreement and share it with their stakeholders, how would they frame it as a win? They're constantly thinking in terms of winning and losing. And so you want to say, disagreeing with me is a loss for you because of this, but agreeing with me and accepting this proposal is actually a win because of this. And the last one is power motivation. So people who are power motivated, they like to have high amounts of influence over other people. It's not necessarily that they want to dominate other people, but if there is a totem pole, they want to be on top. And so the issue with that is oftentimes when people are high in power motivation, they are threatened by people who might be seen as a challenge to them. So a lot of times within an organization, if you have what you think is a great idea, you might always be stifled by the manager and you don't know why. If they're high in power motivation, that might be the issue. Well, this up and comer might take my spot. So if this is what you're realizing, the person wants to maintain that power and they might be seeing you as a threat, what you want to do is you want to say, hey, let me ask you for some advice. I think this is something that could work, but I want to get your idea on it. And so you're kind of stroking their ego saying, hey, this is an idea, let's work on it together. And so you want them to be able to take a little bit of credit or feel a little bit of a sense of ownership over it. So it's not you challenging them, it's you working with them to propose this idea. All right. And so let's wrap up with this case study here. So with this case study, a health equity focused case study, let's say you are in a rural part of Nebraska and the person is kind of resistant to your ideas on equity. And so you're saying, hey, in this next year, what I think we should do is focus on looking at these health challenges that we face in this community through an equity lens. But you're getting resistance because the person says, hey, this is rural Nebraska. We all look the same. So there's no reason to have to talk about equity. But we all recognize that it's not a true monolith, right? There are going to be differences between the people within the community. And so we need to recognize those differences, celebrate those differences, and make policy decisions based on the differences so we can help people more effectively. But the boss is not moving. So what we want to do here is create a focused, customized approach for your boss. And so here are the elements of your boss's personality that you've seen, just based on your 5 years of working with her. So she is low in openness to experience, high in conscientiousness, high in extraversion, high in agreeableness, and high in neuroticism. So based on that personality profile, what types of arguments would you make, or what type of approach would you have for the conversation in order to persuade this person effectively? Just go ahead and put your answers in the chat.
Along with the neuroticism, you might get the feedback of, this is too risky. We can't use the E word. We can't talk about equity.
Yep.
So we might have to find another way to frame it.
Perfect. Beautiful. Good. Very, very good. What other thoughts do we have?
This is a safe alternative that isn't really any different than X, Y, or Z.
Perfect. Safety speaks to neuroticism, and a slight alternative, not that different, speaks to the low and the openness to experience. Very good.
Talk about how it will be a win for her.
Good. High in extroversion, most likely thinking in terms of winning and losing.
This is how it worked in another community similar to ours.
Brilliant. Thinking about how it worked in other communities helps to alleviate the perspective of risk.
Give a lot of details.
Yes. High in conscientiousness, she wants to know that it'll work. So you need to prove it through data and details.
Validate her fears, but offer a positive outcome.
Very good. So the first step in compassionate curiosity. So you're acknowledging the emotions, validating it, but then also ending it with a positive outcome. Very, very good. Perfect. Yes, it's almost like you all have been paying attention to this workshop. That's great. That is very, very great. Good. Yeah, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. This is great. So before we go, I want to open it up to a couple of questions with the remaining time that we have. Katie, are there any questions up there?
I just put a reminder in the chat box to send your questions in. You can put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. On the last call, Kwame, oh, somebody's come in, so I'll do this one. We need to manage up. Can we provide examples of successes and how we learn from others in this idea of needing to kind of manage up?
Mm-hmm. And so when we say managing up, we're talking about our experience working under somebody. How do we persuade our leaders to make a change?
I think so.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to managing up, the thing you really need to be mindful of is the power motivation. We have to recognize that it's not just about coming up with the right answer. It's about recognizing the threats that they see. So the threats that they see aren't just when it comes to health policy and health equity, but it's also the threats that they see to their own livelihood, to their own position. Right. And so oftentimes, if somebody has achieved a high level of success, they don't want to lose that. They always say that the first goal of power is the retention of power. And so there has to be a modicum of humility that we utilize when it comes to these conversations. That's the first thing, because we don't want them to see you as a threat. And the other thing is it might take multiple conversations, because if the person is seeing you as a threat, then we might need to take smaller incremental steps to move their mentality in a way that is a little bit more progressive. So whenever I've seen in the past when people are managing up, as you say, it takes a little bit of time. You need to invest in the relationship and be willing to recognize that it's going to take multiple conversations most likely, but you can still get there through the implementation of a longer term strategy, not just one conversation.
Yeah, so sort of connected to that, Tad asks, if I'm just meeting someone for the first time, how would I get a feel for which traits to focus on?
Brilliant. So personality-based persuasion is going to be most effective with people with whom you have a long-standing relationship, because you have more data points, right? When you first meet somebody, there are going to be too many, it's too small of a sample size, right? We can't extrapolate from such a small sample size. They might be having a bad day. They might be having a good day. That's an astronomically good day. So somebody who is typically very disagreeable is momentarily agreeable, right? And so we just need to recognize that we're taking this data point. So if it's the first time we're meeting somebody, the best way to be able to make a proper assessment of their personality is to have conversations with people who know them beforehand, to get an idea of their reputation, and then start fact checking once you actually have an interaction with them. Because usually what other people say about them, you can start to triangulate a personality from there. And then once you actually meet them, you can start to become a lot more specific with the personality style. So I wouldn't suggest using a personality-based persuasive strategy for the first time you meet somebody, but deeper in the relationship. But at least when you first meet them, you want to have that in mind, saying to yourself, I want to eventually get to that point where I know the person that well. So I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to listen. I'm going to look at the body language, listen to what they say, understand their goals, and get an idea of what motivates them, and start to create that profile so I can persuade more effectively down the road. Really, really, really great point, Tad.
I'm going to ask one more in our last minute and a half here. On the last call, somebody said, when it gets heated, it's hard to remember what we've learned. So do you have any tips or tricks for remembering all of this information that you shared with us in the heat of the moment?
Yes. And so the tip is just focus on the framework. Acknowledge emotions, get curious with compassion, and joint problem solving. All of this other stuff is going to be really tough to remember. But if you remember those 3 steps, then you'll be good. And then if you are in a situation where you're having a conversation and you're starting to go blank and you don't even know what to say, rule of thumb, if you don't know what to say, the next thing you should say is a question. You should ask an open-ended question. So to Jessica, I see she wants me to repeat the 3 steps. Number 1, acknowledge and validate emotions. Number 2, get curious with compassion. And number 3, engage in joint problem solving. Those are the 3 steps. And we're going to go deeper into that in the next session. But if there's nothing else you remember, just remember those 3 steps. If you can't remember the 3 steps, just ask a question because asking a question is a lot safer than saying the wrong thing.
Thank you so much, Kwame. And we have other questions that came in on other calls, and Kwame and I are going to be doing a podcast through his American Negotiation Institute at the end of the 3 series where we talk through some of the questions, the burning questions that people have that didn't get answered. So if you think of any after the call today, feel free to shoot me an email or send them through the evaluation process, and we'll make sure to include them in that podcast. So thank you so much for joining us on the call. We hope to hear from you again for part 3 of the series called Finding Confidence in Conflict. We hope you join us as we wrap up these ideas around persuasive communication, and we hear some specific tactics and strategies and a little bit more about emotion for successfully handling conflict in the workplace.